Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sabah Gul, and I'm the founder of Kamli, which is the Pakistani-American feminist collective that has organized today's event, along with SAAG, South Asian Avant-Garde, a literary magazine for global South Asian solidarities. As I thought about how to open today's event, I thought about the grief and despair of the last 5 months of genocide in Gaza. And I thought of how it's aptly been said that we are not freeing Palestine, but Palestine is freeing us from our complicity in corrupt systems, from our own biases, from our complacency. And we have learned and unlearned so much about ourselves and the world that we live in these past few months. And as we have learned and been inspired by and followed Palestinian activists, writers, artists, scholars, and lawyers, it's impossible to not see the leadership of women in all of this. From the lawyer Noura Arakat, to journalists and live bloggers like Hind Khudari, Plessia Alakad, to New York City's very own Nardeen Kiswani, who has consistently led the largest protests here in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Also in our recent memories is the women-led revolution in Iran and the Baloch March in Pakistan, a movement of unprecedented proportions that mostly went uncovered in media, led by another woman, Mahrang Baloch. Much of this leadership and centrality of women and the stories of women in liberation struggles is erased or diminished in history, in media coverage, and in our consciousness. And it's here that the concept for today's event took root. Women have always been pioneers of revolutionary thinking and have conceived and led revolutionary movements in unique and powerful ways that men often haven't. Because a revolution, by definition, is an upending, is a dismantling of the status quo. And women are particularly interested in dismantling the status quo because we aren't the status quo. We are never the status quo. The status quo is male, but it's also white, it's heterosexual, it's wealthy, it's able, and it's Western. And so women have always found allies along all these dimensions of disprivilege in their revolutions. Now, as we have today's conversation, I encourage each of you to think of revolution and resistance, not only in political and global terms as mobilizations of people and causes, but also of the revolution of the heart, of the personal rebellions and resistances in your lives, inside your homes, with your families, with your friends. Because as Eleanor Roosevelt famously said, where after all does change begin? In small spaces close to home, so small you cannot see them on a map. And so the socio-political liberations that we'll talk about today are metaphors for your personal revolution, for the rebellion of your heart. I am proud to be from a country that is home to one of the largest, most intersectional, most powerful movements for social change in recent history, the Aurat March, or the Women's March in Pakistan. And it's the Aurat March that helped the little bud of rebellion in my heart take full bloom. And it's Aurat March that led to the creation of the feminist collective Kamli that I started, and that became the inspiration for the Women's Day events that we've held. The first one was last year, the second one is this year. And we will continue to create this space every year for all of us to come together in our rebellion and in our joy as women and as allies. If you want to be involved in next year's event, come find me later. So, let's begin. I am going to start by inviting our 3 phenomenal panelists to the stage so I can introduce them to you. Yeah, you can all come up. Gulalai, Suchitra, so seated right next to me is Gulalai Politkovskaya Award presented at the Women in the World Festival in 2018. Gulalai lives in political exile in the US. Seated next to Gulalai is Suchitra. Suchitra Vijayan is a lawyer, essayist, and award-winning photographer working across oral history, state violence, and visual storytelling. She is the author of the critically acclaimed Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, as well as co-author of her more recent book, How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? A Look at Authoritarian India Through the Experiences of Political Prisoners. Suchitra worked for the UN War Crimes Tribunal in Yugoslavia and Rwanda before founding the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo. She's also the founder of the Polis Project, a research and journalism organization. She teaches at NYU Gallatin and Columbia University. Next to Suchitra is Gaiutra. Gaiutra Bahadur is a Guyanese-American writer and associate professor of English and journalism at Rutgers University, New York. Her book, Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, is a narrative history of indentured women in the Caribbean and was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2014. The audiobook for Coolie Woman, read by Gaiutra, was just released last week. As a reporter, Gaiutra has covered politics, immigration, and demographics across the US and worked in Night Raiders Baghdad Bureau during the Iraq War. As an essayist, critic, and journalist, she's been published in the New York Times, Book Review, The Nation, and many others. Thank you so much for joining us, Suchitra, Gaiutra, and Gulalai. Okay, Gulalai, I'm going to start with you. You have played a pivotal role in the Pashtun Tahafuz movement. You've been an activist your entire life, and you have faced incredible amounts of state intimidation and harassment, and your family in Pakistan continues to face it. I'd love for you to talk about your role in the Pashtun Tahafuz movement when you were in Pakistan, and the leadership of Pashtun and Baloch women in resistance movements in Pakistan, and unique challenges that they face that are gendered in nature.
Wow, that's a lot. So I would like to give a bit of context of Pashtun Tahafuz movement, is just in case people don't know what the movement is about. Most of the movements in Pakistan have emerged in specific context. Most of the movements have emerged during the worst dictatorships in Pakistan. I come from the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan. It's a northwestern province which has border with Afghanistan. We are the region of Pakistan that Pakistan state has used as its backyard for promoting, harboring terrorist outfits that it can use in its strategic depth policies. It is also not just a backyard of Pakistan military establishment, it has also been a backyard of international imperialist forces. So even during the Cold War, when US wanted to go after the expansion of Soviet Union in Afghanistan, it was our people, our region that was used. Islamic militancy was promoted to defeat the expansion of Soviet Union in Afghanistan. That Islamic militancy or that Cold War came at the cost of promoting Islamic extremism among our people. Then after 9/11, when US decided to start war against terrorism, once again, the terrorist groups, Afghan Taliban, they moved from Afghanistan and through the porous border came to the tribal areas or to our province. And there they made alliances with local extremists. Another group emerged called as Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Then millions of dollars were poured in Pakistan to fight against Talibanization, against terrorism. So terrorism became a good business. It was a business that was earning Pakistan millions of dollars. Counterterrorism, dozens of counterterrorism operations were conducted in our region, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, in the Pashtun region. These operations were conducted. So at one hand, militancy, Islamic militancy, Talibanization was promoted in our region, and that militancy, it eroded our culture, it eroded our political spaces. Thousands of progressive political workers, and thousands of local elders, thousands of people who were local leaders, they were killed by the Taliban so that they can promote, they can create space for themselves. Leadership vacuum was created. So on one hand, people were getting killed by these terrorist groups. And on the other hand, when Pakistani state decided to do military operations, in those military operations, grave human rights abuses were committed against the local people. It was used, terrorism was used, counter-terrorism was used as an excuse to provide a cover to the human rights abuses of Pakistan military, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killing, landmines, everything became, all of these strategies were used, warlike tactics were used against civilians, against the dissidents. So in that, while all of that was happening, I was a young person in the 1990s when the Cold War was happening. I was a young person, and I was seeing that young people of my region, they were being recruited by these militant organizations, by these Taliban organizations. I grew up in an era where I would see slogans of these militant groups openly calling for recruitment, openly calling for the promise of heaven if young people would go and join these militant organizations. And all of this was then allowed by the Pakistani state, because Pakistani state, in alliance with the United States, wanted us to become Islamic militants. They wanted us to go and fight in Afghanistan. So I was growing up in that era, and that was initially, I was really, so I used to be so angry at my father for like, why he's not letting us to go and fight jihad, why he does not want to go to heaven. And then it was like when my father realized that my father was a peace worker, he was a follower of Bacha Khan, he was a follower of nonviolence. And when he saw that his own children are not safe from the state propaganda, it was then that my father started like working with me, and he took me to the spaces where I could get exposure to ideas that were different. But anyways, from my own experience, I learned from my own experience, and then I decided that I will work with other young people that are vulnerable like me, prevent them from joining militant organizations. So I was working from 2000, from 2002, I was working as an activist on women's rights, that I'll maybe talk later if time allows. But since 2009, when the Taliban took control of Swat Valley, one of the region in our province, when they took full control of it, it was then I decided I have to work with young people of my nation, my ethnicity should not, no more, they should no more be a cannon fodder for the strategic depth policies of Pakistan and international imperialist projects. So that's how my work started, Youth Peace Network, and throughout the years, I worked with thousands of young people to teach nonviolence to them, to engage them in interfaith dialogues, to engage them in study circles and activities where they can see themselves, where they can explore, where they can work as leaders for peace building in their communities. And while I was doing all that peace building work, this movement in 2017, as I told you that military operations were happening in our area against Pakistan, was at one hand promoting terrorism, on the other hand it was doing counter-terrorism operations that include human rights abuses. So when one generation of elders were killed, 10, 20 in the past 2 decades ago, there were children who were, during those operations, children who were displaced, children who lived, who grew up in the middle of these suicide attacks and in the middle of war. They had become young. They had moved to the urban centers because they were displaced due to these operations. They were displaced from their villages. In 2017ish, in that, it was the year when those children had become young, and they said no. They said that there will be no more state enforced terrorism. And there was one incident that sparked the whole movement. One young guy, he was killed as usual in extrajudicial killing. His name was Naqibullah Masood. In 2017, he was killed in a fake police encounter. And as usual, the police say that he was a terrorist and we killed him. And people say no more killing of us in the name of counterterrorism. He was not a terrorist. He was just a young people who aspired to be a model. And that movement, protest movement started, and that those countrywide protests, they culminated in a movement called as Pashtun Tahafuz Movement.
Thanks, Gulalai. We'll come back to your role within the PTM, but that was really helpful context on why and how the PTM started. Gaiutra, I'm going to move to you for the next question. So your book, Coolie Woman, has this kind of very subversive position amidst a history of erasure of women's stories that is a very pervasive sort of systemic thing. Your book is the story of indentured Indian women in the Caribbean, particularly your great-grandmother, Sujaria from Bhurapur. And it is the history of indenture, the system that for 80 years after the abolition of slavery provided bonded labor to plantation owners across the globe. I would, and all the stories you tell, I mean, of colonization, power, abuse, gender, a legacy that lives on today in Guyana are so relevant today to this moment in time. I'd love for you to talk about your journey to telling these women's stories in the absence of any first-hand accounts. You did this investigation and this research, and you told stories that sort of rescued the individuality of your subjects with very personal, very human stories of song and worship and falling in love and reinventing yourself. So talk about your process and your journey of creating this wonderful piece of literature.
Thank you so much, Sawa. And thank you for all the context you gave as well, just to situate the history of indenture. So this book came out 10 years ago. I'm still on the journey. I think it started, in fact, in New Jersey, in Jersey City in the 80s. That's where I grew up. I was born in Guyana, about a mile from the plantation where my great-grandmother had worked. My family migrated in the 80s. As sort of part of, this fear of physical violence in an Indian-looking body that was not Indian, in fact, and curiosity about my family's connection to India is what led me to start working on this book. So I think it was motivated by identity, migrants' search for identity, that old story. But as I started looking and asking questions of my father, my aunts, and digging around in archives in Guyana, I realized that this was essentially, what was most compelling to me were the stories of women, not just my great-grandmother, and truly deeply revolutionary women, in fact. My father first told me about my great-grandmother, and he said he didn't know very much about her. He'd known her as a boy, helped take care of her, but he didn't know much about her past. What he did know was that she was a pregnant woman traveling alone. And having grown up in a pretty protected Desi household, super protected because of the violence outside as well, I was just stunned by the story of, a woman alone, and questions about, my grandfather was born on a ship from India to Guyana, and there was a whole lot of mystery around who his father was, right? So suddenly there is this story, and there are all sorts of uncertainties and whispers about it. It took 5 years to research and write the book. I went to the Colonial Office Archives in the UK, which is a space that's maybe the opposite of revolutionary. It's full of white men telling our stories in very racist, biased terms. But what really stunned me was how women were nonetheless, sort of, despite the archives, able to speak, or were at least speaking to me, as I worked with those documents. And I'll just tell you the story of one woman. What I knew about my great-grandmother was fairly limited, so I decided that I would tell a larger story, a story about indentured women, because so many of them fit her profile. That is to say, most of them were traveling by themselves without husbands, and had sort of these intimations of scandal and rupture in their backgrounds. So, you know, when I went to the archives, I was, like I said, amazed by the flashes I was able to get of women's lives and women's attitude, even. I'll just share one story. There was an indentured woman in Guyana who sued the Guyanese state. And she sued around an incident that, again, seemed like full of scandal and whisper involving 5 different men she was allegedly connected to sexually or romantically, including 2 white men, a police inspector, and yes, a sub-inspector, right? So I won't share the soap operatic background to all of that. It involved, you know, disputes with her Indian husband and these other men, and her husband trying to get back jewelry that he'd given to her because she left. But she sued after the Guyanese police inspector basically put her under surveillance. She was being watched for a month, right? So when she sought redress, it was not just about her own particular situation, but about the situation of Indians in the Guyanese capital who were being racially profiled. And that was something I found in the archives. And it was obviously prepared by an attorney. She signed with an X because she couldn't sign her name. So, I mean, I could go on forever about the multiple forms of resistance I found in the archives. Women questioning directly the state, women questioning directly their male partners, and I guess we can talk more about it in the Q&A, but my journey was one essentially of being stunned by these women and compelled to tell as many of their stories as I possibly could. And if there's one criticism of the book, it's the density of detail. It's like, did you need to tell the story of every woman you found in the archives? Yes, God damn it, I did, you know.
Suchitra, your book, Midnight's Children, tells stories of... Midnight's Borders, sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Your book, Midnight's Borders, tells stories of dispossession, of histories and homes being violently erased. And central to your book are so many themes that are viscerally connected to this current moment in time as the world looks to Gaza. The question of maps and borders and who gets to define them, theft of land, colonial plunder, all of these themes are in your book, and we could talk about all of them. But I think the manner in which you tell these stories raises some very interesting questions about who tells the story and how. And I'm going to read a quote from one of your interviews for PEN America, where you said, "Good writing, I believe, is letting the clarity and courage speak for themselves without inserting myself as the interlocutor or the interpreter. As I say in the book, I don't intend to give voice to the voiceless. Instead, these stories are a way to interrogate the power." So tell us about how you, create this narrative that does not dehumanize.
Can you hear me? All right, great. Thank you for that question. And that's actually a PhD thesis in the making, right? Like, how does one tell the story of dehumanization when the only stories that we are often told about ourselves, reflected everywhere, is the story of dehumanization? So I don't know how to answer this question anymore, because every time I try answering it, I feel like the answer gets more and more muddled. So one of the things that I really did want to do, but the story of this book actually starts in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. As a graduate student, I was in Paktika province in Afghanistan. Initially, the questions that I went there my research was supposed to look at US counterinsurgency policies in Afghanistan. The moment I got there, I realized how limited and my questions lacked imagination, it lacked history, it lacked so much. The moment I got on the ground, I realized that the stories that are demanded of us are not the stories we should tell. We should resist telling the stories that are demanded of us. And very soon when I came back, it was my first moment kind of trying to tell myself that there seems to be something fundamentally wrong. Because 9/11 happened days before I was heading out from high school to university, And 10 years had passed in between before the time 9/11 had happened, and I ended up in Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And for a decade, the stories I was told about this region was not the region I saw in front of me, right? And that began, in some ways, the process of how does one tell stories when we are often told to tell only a certain kind of stories. And that, in some ways, led to Midnight's Borders, because then the question began, if I traveled through the same contentious lines that defined the so-called secular, independent, democratic Republic of India, even those contentious lines that the very people who are enclosed within it don't often agree on, what stories will we find? And when writing that story, one of the things I became very militant about was not putting myself in the story. As certain kind of bodies who are written and heard from, especially in the heart of the empire, we are often tokenized. We become the eloquent voice of the empire, which meant that how does then write those stories? Not for the empire, but for our own people, for our own communities. And I think that's how it really started. And one of the things that I really told myself was that I would not this is often used phrase when you go to journalism school or if you're an MFA, that we give voice to the voiceless. No one needs to give voice to the voiceless. And as Arundhati Roy says, there is nothing called the voiceless, there are only those who are silenced. And the people that I met through my journeys were some of the most articulate people of their history, of their politics, of their resistance. They did not require me to tell their story. What they required, or what I required to do, was to interrogate. So this book was immediately ethnography of power, ethnography of a cruel state that was colonizing people, dispossessing. And I'll end with this quote that one of the first field interviews I did was in the India-Bangladesh border. And there's this incredible line this person tells me is that when someone asks for my name, I say I'm someone who has lost my home many times over. And that became a powerful guiding light for the book, because we are telling stories of people who have lost their homes over and over again. And that didn't begin with the partition, it didn't end with the partition. And today when you see Muslim homes being taken away, erased and dispossessed, you're seeing that people lose their homes again. When Muslims in India are asked, where do they belong? The fact that they have to answer that question is such violence, right? So in some ways, I think so much of the writing now is, I think, as writers, our job is, this is when our job begins, when the world is on fire. And in so many ways, I think, I also get to draw inspiration from writers, another thing that I have forgot to tell is that the first time I actually saw you was during your book launch 10 years ago. And then I stalked her on Facebook, and then she was very nice to meet me in this cafe in Chinatown. And you also have these precedents of people who write in a beautiful way, where you can tell our stories in a way that is about not giving voice to the voiceless, but trying to interrogate the ethnography of power.
Suchitra, I'm going to ask you one more question and then move to, we apparently have less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one quick question to each of you and then we'll move to the audience. But I'm going to start with you because you were already sort of on a roll with what I wanted to ask. So I'd love for you to talk very briefly about the unique ways in which Indian women journalists and writers have led the charge in confronting the fascism of the Indian state.
I mean, women have always defied state, right? I mean, you could trace this history back. You could go back to Savitribai Phule. I mean, you could go back all the way to the colonial era where you had women defying the state. But today I want to, I think, mention a couple of places that are doing the work. Khabar Lahariya is one of those places. There are some incredible organizations run by Dalit journalists in India who continue to do the incredible work. Sukanya Shanta, who works for The Wire, continues to report on political prisoners. This book exists because of journalists like her who create the primary source of doing that. I want to talk about Annie Zaidi, who's a writer, poet, playwright, and if you haven't, I urge all of you to pick up a book called Prelude to a Riot. Incredible book in which in that little moment of fiction you can tell what happens to a man, what is going to happen to him, and how the society, the community he thought was his was just turning. I can spend an entire day listing all of these remarkable women, but I just want people to know that they are there, they're doing the work, and it's just remarkable to see the kind of work that they're putting out every single day. As I said, the list is long. I'm happy to email all of you the list of all these remarkable women.
Thank you. Gulalai, you set up the Seeds of Peace Network in 2010, which trains young people in human rights and political leadership, and particularly encourages the participation of women in politics in Pakistan. There's lots of other female PTM activists that we can talk about that work with you: Ismat Shah Jahan, Bushra Gohar, Jamila Gilani, Sanaya Jas. I mean, all of them inspiring, really role models for all of us. But talk to us a little bit about the participation of women in politics in Pakistan, and very specifically the particular threat that PTM female activists pose to the state, because they can't be demonized as easily as PTM male activists.
I thought the question will be what are the threats that the state posed to PTM, to the female activists of PTM? I think that would be the right question. So as I said, that my work has been, for past 2 decades, my work has been on promoting alternative narratives of non-violence in our region to counter the militancy that the state has been promoting. And I think that peace-building work is incomplete without women's political empowerment, because we believe that only if women are in political spaces, if women are decision makers, only then it will be possible for us to shape the kind of peace that we want to have. And even when PTM emerged in 2018, it was the way women participated in the movement. It was that moment in our history when it was beginning of a new history. It was that moment that a new history was about to begin. And when a new history was about to begin, we women activists, we wanted to make sure that this new history is not without us, that this new history is not without our issues on the agenda. We wanted that the new movement, when people look back at the history, women's stories should be used, and women's stories will be used to remember that movement. So it was a movement that was dismantling the status quo. And as you mentioned, that when there is a movement that dismantles the status quo, women have automatically, organically, women have interest in that movement, because we want to dismantle the status quo. And when that movement emerged, I remember when we used to go. It was like a sit-in, and we used to go there almost on daily basis. We would sit there, and then we were like, more women should be here. And we started reaching out to women, and it was, I think, 8th March that was decided to be Women's Day within the movement. And we started reaching out to women, talking about this movement. And on the 8th March, hundreds of women came to the movement. And then the organizers of the sit-in, they were like, if women are here in the movement, they will not be the audience. They will not be just kind of like be the passive participant. We want them to be on the stage. We want them to lead us. And the whole stage was left for women to moderate, to take over. Women took over the stage. Asma Jahangir was present there on that day. Unfortunately, 2 days after that event, she died. So that was called as a revolution within the revolution, because hundreds of women took the stage of Pashtun Tahafuz Movement, and that changed the history. This is what we wanted. It did change the history, because after that, the doors that had opened up for women in the movement, that doors never closed. Hundreds of women started taking part in the movement, they were showing solidarity, and that is why the state felt threatened, because for a very long, the state had invested billions of dollars in creating a dehumanized image of the Pashtun ethnicity, like people who are extremely backward, people who are still living in some tribal ages, and people who oppress their women. So when women were taking part in the movement, it was basically the state, the whole narrative of the state was getting dismantled. And people were seeing that, these are actually regular people like us. They are regular people where women also take part in political processes, women take part in the movement. And that is why I think the state felt really threatened. And it is just like Baloch movement, the Baloch Jahidi movement, or the women of Balochistan, the state has shown extra heavy-handedness when it comes to women activists. Like sedition charges have been filed, sedition treason cases have been filed against women activists of PTM. We have been forced into exile, like I have been forced into to live in exile. And the state hard-handedness doesn't end with legal persecution or exile. Like even when I came to the US after I was placed on a kill list, I managed to came here, and that was such a big blow to the small ego of the big military establishment of Pakistan, that they decided to go after my parents. My mother is a housewife, like thousands of Pakistani women. She's a housewife. She does not even have a social media account. Like many women, like many women in Pakistan, she uses my father's Twitter and Facebook even to stalk us. but even cases of terrorism was filed against my mother. My mother was placed in exit control list, and the letter that was sent to my mother, it was the first paragraph of the letter is that the cabinet has decided to put you on exit control list because you give suggestions to your husband on how to protect your daughters. That was the reason that so I think, yeah, that the state feels more threatened because from women activists of PTM and also from Baloch women, because we are dismantling state project to erase Pashtun and Baloch women.
Gaiutra, really quickly, I think we're sort of over time, just have a minute left, but I'd love for you to talk about something you mentioned in one of our conversations about the current women-led resistance against petroleum groups in the Caribbean.
Absolutely. So my work has shifted to informal empire, and I spent 5 months reporting on ExxonMobil's presence in Guyana. They discovered oil there in 2015, and by 2030, Guyana will be ExxonMobil's largest source of oil globally, which is transforming a very poor country in dizzying and staggering ways. And I was there reporting on how it's changing the country for good or ill. And one thing that really struck me was the fact that most of the people on the ground asking questions about ExxonMobil and the government's regulation of its offshore development and also onshore projects are women. There is Red Thread, which is an organization that has historically been devoted to combating intimate partner violence. And there are other individuals who are suing the government over their lack of regulation, the EPA over its lack of regulation, the single attorney, well, there are a few, but the attorney behind most of the suits working pro bono is a woman, and I'm really intrigued that this active questioning of a multinational is being led on so many fronts by women.
We're going to switch to audience questions. Noor?
Does anyone have questions?
Thank you guys so much. That was spectacular and fascinating. I'm kind of stuck on this idea of like, maybe one way to put it is like social and political legibility, right? Like telling stories that fit a narrative that then allow for a kind of proliferation and for people to see it as something that makes sense to them. And one of the reasons this is like, that feels important to me is that I'm really interested in the question of trauma and the ways that trauma kind of gets mobilized as a category that allows for, either the kind of stock victim figure to take on a certain sense of selfhood and agency in the political public sphere, or alternately to be silenced by state projects like you were talking about. And I guess I wonder, like, the negotiation that requires to be able to tell stories that, as you're saying, don't do the classic, like giving the voice to the voiceless, but at the same time, perhaps allow for a kind of legibility in the spheres where like meaningful change of whatever kind needs to be enacted, or if it feels like we simply cannot take legibility in mainstream spaces as a goal at all, and we need to like eschew that in favor of other ways of being or telling stories.
You should do it first, and I'll follow up.
If I were worried about legibility in mainstream spaces, this book would not have been published. It was such a hard sell because, to quote Saidiya Hartman, the stories are impossible, and there are stories of deep trauma, again, unspeakable violence. There are stories of shame, or the messages that shame should be felt for the things that our great grandmothers did, right? So I don't worry about that. I just tell the story that as I find it, and lo and behold, 10 years later, I feel very happy to say that this started a conversation, right? And so many other writers and artists have been able to step into it with their own narratives, right? Because, it gave permission on some level to tell these stories in an honest and unconventional way.
The place that the state spends the most in terms of resources, in terms of time, is the narrative. The state spends the time crafting the narrative. And that's why when you have Palestinian journalists from the ground telling the story in the way that is authentic to them, it becomes the most powerful testimony. And there's another thing. I read this quote. I do not know who said this. It says that, there's something about the stories because they taught us to fear the witches and not the people who burnt them. That is storytelling. And there are books that today would not exist if the people who tried to conform to the kind of structure. Our job as writers is to militate and constantly militate. And one of the problems is that the corporatization of writing also means that you produce MFA novels. Nothing wrong with the MFA program, but an MFA novel is exactly that. I do this exercise in my class where I print out 5 or 6 long-form essays. I erase the names of the writers, and I ask my students, can you identify who these writers are? And they cannot. We've taken style, we've taken ideas, we've taken form. So no, legibility makes no sense. If anything, your story will find the form, and your job is to write it and put it out, and it'll find its time. That's been my experience.
Hi, first of all, I just wanted to thank all of you for your time and labor in sharing with us. Very honored to learn from you. My question is inspired by Suchitra, but it's for the entire panel. And for context, while I may have several identities that make me marginalized, I'm also Brahmin and we're scum. So my question is, as people with privilege who are privileged enough to be listening and learning from people who are marginalized, how do we adapt our active listening praxis to account for the work that you've done to be able to fully absorb the narrative that these people are sharing, instead of falling victim or instead of falling prey to the programming of imperialism that causes us to view these people as the voice of the voiceless in the first place. Thank you.
It's nothing I say will answer that question. I think we all have to be cognizant of our privilege, and I think where this works is we need to unlearn the idea of the individual and move towards the collective. When a work is done as a community, as a collective, it becomes different. You're always, yes, it's harder, but also you're constantly in struggle, you're constantly in conversation. The willingness to humble oneself, the willingness to give credit to someone else. I have a lot of respect for people who co-write, co-create. I like we more than I. But at the same time, I cannot to write a book that takes 9 years is also a certain kind of privilege. And I think to constantly interrogate your privilege is important. Again, it's also important for us to understand that just because we perform our acknowledgement of privilege doesn't mean I can change the material difference of somebody who is Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, or a Muslim in India today. I can say, oh, I am privileged, I am a child of a Hindu father, I speak English, I have class mobility. Now I've narrated my privilege to you, but has it made material change to the person on the ground? So I think it's also moving away from the performance of narrating our privilege to actually doing work. And this is not going to be perfect. This is not going to be, you are going to make mistakes. My privilege has also taught me to see the world in a very specific way. I am going to be prejudiced. I am, even as I learn to not be casteist, my ideas are, and I think that is something that, as I said, there's no right answer, and it's just a process. And again, we shouldn't stop with the performance of privilege.
Other questions? No?
Other questions?
This one here.
Hi. I'm sad that there is less time because the conversation has only just begun and I want to hear so much more. So feedback for next time is लंबा time चाहिए. ये बहुत बहुत मज़े का है and इतना होता नहीं है न्यूयॉर्क में. So thank you. This is so enlightening. And thinking through all of you, it's just कितना power है इधर. बहुत मज़ा आ रहा है.
Yay!
So I'm thinking of, because Suchitra, I'm familiar with your work on Polis Project and your work with so much with the women's movement, and how I know most of your work is through the digital medium. And here we spend years writing, and the stories, you can't even tell what it takes to write a book. But the social media, excuse my language, generation, and state projects of surveillance, right? There's a particular kind of cyber trauma on the performance of an activist. Immediate Twitter, immediate Facebook, immediate Instagram, immediate WhatsApp, which I kind of then died through it. This is obviously in Pakistan. The privilege obviously was that, when Manzoor Pashtun or all the activists are going live in Pashto from some part of FATA, you can see it in Karachi or New York, even if you don't understand a word of Pashto. And 20,000 people are online. Remarkable movement building that at least I saw with the PTM and participated in. Because it was this online, offline, throbbing event when he's being harassed by the intelligence in Islamabad, he can't board the flight, we are all on our Twitters waiting for him in Karachi. Strange, we've never experienced this kind of real-time digital mobilization when the whole Pakistani army's billions of dollars have gone to waste, right? Because there's a thriller going on, and obviously you know what I mean. That there are mega projects of surveillance now against Kashmiri activists, against Baloch, mega projects. They're there to defame you, especially against women. So I want all of you, I don't know what's happening in Guyana with the new oil industry. How are they containing us through social media? Why? Because I think it rapidly took off in Pakistan. Now Twitter has been off and all these things that happen. So I'm just curious how you position yourself with this dynamic.
Gulalai, why don't you take that? And I think that might be the last question that we can... We have a couple of minutes. Okay, great. We can take one more.
I agree with everything that you have said, Nosheen. So on one hand, social media became our powerhouse because it was through social media that we could amplify our voices and we could reach to to the mainland of Pakistan. We were considered a periphery for a very long time and still considered a periphery till now, but it was through social media that the periphery could come to the center, could take center stage in Pakistan. But at one hand, Pakistan, if it gave us power to mobilize, to connect with other people, as a woman activist, it has been so helpful for us, because, and especially coming from Pashtun society, where women's presence in public spaces has been largely erased by the state, by the society, and by culture. Social media provided us the space to unerase ourselves and to tell our stories, to share our point of view. It won't be possible for me as a Pashtun woman maybe to stand in my street and give my opinions or say some things, but it is very possible for me to write something on my Facebook or Twitter, and all these people, they can still see me. They can still see my opinion. So it was making not just the movements, women are becoming more visible in Pashtun society. Women are becoming more visible through social media. But unfortunately, the state has also been using, and not just after PTM, even before the emergence of Pashtun Tahafuz movement, Pakistani state has been very active on doing social media surveillance and introducing laws such as cybercrime laws to curb the dissent. So cybercrime law has been one of the biggest weapon of Pakistani state to curb the voices of dissent. People are booked in my own father was abducted from the premises of Peshawar High Court. My father was abducted, and then he was booked in case of cybercrime law, and he faced the trial for almost not the trial, but just for the bail cancellation things. He had to go to the court for 4 years. He had to appear in dates in that case. So yeah, so the state is trying to take back of the control of that space, but I think it's not kind of like, it's not the mainstream media. It's not like Geo Television that you will call the owner and ask the owner to remove a journalist or to remove, or you will stop giving ads to them. So I think even if the states try to control social media, people will find a way to use it. I don't think they can control the space the way they wish to.
Maybe one more question, if we can keep it short. Thank you.
Okay, let's try to keep the question short. Thanks.
I'll try to keep it short. It's at this moment, it's sort of hard not to talk about Palestine. And so one of the things I'm noticing is that looking at resistance movements in, say, the 1940s, 60s, where nonviolence was used against the state and there was some impact, inexact as it was, there were some liberation movements. But now one of the things that I notice in Gaza and the Israeli state is that the gloves are off, there's no restraints, right? The state has so much power to control narrative, weaponized narrative, arms, weapons that you never heard of before used against resistance movements. So I say this with a lot of emotion because what is the scope of our liberation movements when the state has become so uber powerful? How much impact did we have using strategies like non-resistance and so forth at this particular moment? What is the hope for us, I guess, is the bottom line question. Non-violence or resistance in general, non-state, resistance against the state. When the state is so powerful and able and willing to do anything, whether we use violence or non-violence in resistance, like what are the options at this moment for us? It feels such like a hopeless moment in a sense.
Suchitra, you want to start? Go ahead.
I want to say that hope is important. It's radical, it's important. And I'm not talking about hope as this idea that something will get better. No. I think revolutionary feminist politics is demanding a utopia, continuing to work for conditions that seem impossible today. And I say this because my grandfather was a subject of a colony. When my grandfather was born, he was a subject of the British Empire, right? In his lifetime, my grandfather passed away in 2004, 2005. In my lifetime, I knew somebody who was a colonized body. Large parts of the world were told that we were less than human and we were denied the right, that we could not be given self-rule because we were subhuman, that we lacked the capacity to rule ourselves. This was not distant past. This was very much the reality less than 75 years ago. There was a time in this country when I could not have had the capacity to buy a piece of land. 50 years ago, if I had immigrated here in some other capacity, I would not have access to the land. The reason I have access to the capacity to just exist and move happened because black people in this country marched. They marched then, they march today, they will continue to do it. Our job is to constantly keep demanding for that utopian proposal that seems impossible today. I know it sounds exhausting, we've been marching, it feels, but we have to do it. And I say this because when I first moved to New York, I was there in one of the first Palestinian protests. You know how many people turned up? Guess how many people turned up? 5. 5 people turned up. It was Nora Arakat, and then a bunch of others, and me. I didn't even know who this person was. 5 people turned up, right? Do you know how many, today before I left, I was in a march at Union Square. Do you know how many people are in Union Square today? There are helicopters, drones. I was in a teach-in in Columbia Law School. If somebody told me 2 years ago, Columbia Law School students are going to be doing Palestinian teach-ins, I would have been like, no. I lived with people who were part of the revolution in Egypt. When I left Cairo in 2009, if somebody told me a revolution was about to get on the street, I would have been like, no way. Egyptians are the most apathetic people, because I thought I knew. Thank God historians and journalists and political scientists are wrong all the time. Thank God we cannot predict the future. In our lifetime, we have to believe that we will see a free Palestine, a free Sudan, a free Kashmir, a free, and I think that happens today. Maybe it's going to be hard, it's going to be exhausting, but if we do not do that, what else hope is there? I mean, if we say, no, this is not going to happen, there is no hope left. And I think, yes, it's hard. And powerless people have the right to resist by no means, by every means possible. And I think that is something that we have to believe.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. That was such an inspiring note to finish the panel on. And we could go on forever, but thank you so much. We're going to take... Yes. There's no other option. So we're going to take a few minutes to transition to the next segment of our program. It's going to be a little bit of a setup happening here. Are you ready? Okay, if I can request everyone to take their seats because the band is ready. Guys, can everyone take their seats again, please? All right, I am so thrilled to introduce Apoorva Mudgal Ensemble. Apoorva Mudgal Ensemble is Apoorva Mudgal, Hindustani vocals, Q Morrow at guitar, and Yakuba Sissoko with kora, the African harp. The ensemble is going to perform songs with theme of resistance and revolution. This includes original compositions for poems by Zehra Nigah, Parveen Shakir, and Shubha Mudgal Prasoon Joshi. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Sabah. Oh, there's feedback. First of all, what an honor to be voicing angst and concern and be asked to speak or sing my mind along with these beautiful musicians here, Qbert and Yakuba. Thank you, Sabah, Kamli, and South Asian Avant-Garde for creating this space for us. I'm going to begin with a poem by one of the biggest threats to authority to have ever existed in Pakistan, Kishwar Nahid. How many Urdu Hindi speakers do we have in the room? Just curious. Okay. So I will translate. The poet says, ये हम गुनहगार औरतें हैं, ये हम गुनहगार औरतें हैं जो अहले जुब्बा की तमकनत से न रोब खाएं, न जान बेचें, न सर झुकाएं, न हाथ जोड़ें। ये हम गुनहगार औरतें हैं कि जिनके जिस्मों की फसलें बेचे जो लोग, वो सरफराज ठहरे, नियाबत इम्तियाज ठहरे, वो दावरे अहले साज ठहरे। ये हम गुनहगार औरतें हैं कि सच का परचम उठा के निकलें तो झूठ से शाहराहें अटी मिले हैं, हर एक दहलीज पे सजाओं की दास्तानें रखी मिले हैं, जो बोल सकती थीं वो ज़बानें कटी मिले हैं। ये हम गुनहगार औरतें हैं कि अब ताक़ुब में रात भी आए तो ये आँखें नहीं बुझेंगी, कि जो अब दीवार गिर चुकी है उसे उठाने की जिद न करना, ये हम गुनहगार औरतें हैं जो अहले जुब्बा की तमकनत से न रोक खाएं, न जान बेचें, न सर झुकाएं, न हाथ जोड़ें. It is we sinful women. We sinful women who are not awed by the grandeur of those who wear robes. We do not sell our souls. We do not bow our heads. We do not fold our hands. It is we sinful women, the harvest of whose bodies, when sold, makes the seller distinguished, honorable. It is we sinful women that when we uphold the banner of truth and walk, we find highways blocked with lies. We find punishments placed on every doorstep. We find that the tongues that could have spoken have been severed. It is we sinful women who will not stop, even if now night descends on our courage. Our eyes will not be dimmed. Now that this wall has been raised, do not request to build it again. It is we sinful women. We do not sell our souls. We do not bow our heads. And we do not fold our hands. This next piece is by Zahra Nigar, also a great threat to conformity, to authority. In the 1980s, when the Zia-ul-Haq regime descended on Pakistan, it was like the end of hope, because a lot of the ordinances affected women disproportionately. And Zahra Nigar wrote, describing her experience in the household. In Urdu poetry or classical Urdu ghazal or nazm, this idea of a woman is more powerful than the woman actually being a human. It is glorified, it is exalted, and when women actually want to speak about their real experiences after achieving this goal of marriage and the consummation of love, it is often silenced because it is not comfortable. So Zahra Nigar says, ये सच है यहाँ शोर ज़्यादा नहीं होता, घर बार के बाजार में मगर क्या नहीं होता. Note the use of the word bazaar for a household. सच है यह शोर ज़्यादा नहीं होता, घर बार के बाजार में पर क्या नहीं होता, नहीं होता. जज्बे दिल पे महर का चर्चा नहीं होता, नहीं होता. तारीकी शब में कोई चेहरा नहीं होता, नहीं होता, नहीं होता. जज्बाए मासूम की लग जाती है बोली, कहने को खरीदार पराया नहीं होता, औरत के खुदा दो हैं हकीकी और मिजाजी, पर उसके लिए कोई भी अच्छा नहीं होता। शब भर का तेरा जागना अच्छा नहीं ज़हरा, फिर दिन का कोई काम भी पूरा नहीं होता। शब भर का तेरा जागना अच्छा नहीं ज़हरा, फिर दिन का कोई काम भी पूरा नहीं होता। हाँ ये सच है, यह शोर ज़्यादा नहीं होता। घर बार के बाजार में पर क्या 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 नहीं होता, नहीं होता। Zahra Nigah basically turns the idea of the idealized beloved and idealized love and the moth and the flame on its head when she says, you know what? What happened to me being the muse and you being the destroyed lover after we got married? Like, you know, right now I'm bearing the entire emotional and physical weight of your household and being the mother of your children. Whatever happened to your promises, bro? This next poem is by Prasoon Joshi and featured in an album called Man Ke Manjeere by Apoorva Mudgal. The writer says, from a woman's perspective, so in South Asia, well, everywhere, it's common for fathers to give their daughters in marriage. And this daughter implores her father not to give her to a sunar or a jeweler because she does not like jewels. She says, do not give me to a vyapari or businessman because I don't like money. She says, don't give me to a king because I don't know how to rule. And then she says, you can actually give me to a blacksmith though, because he will help me melt down my chains. जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए, बिन बोले रहा ना जाए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए। बाबुल मोरी इतनी अरज सुन लीजो, मोहे सुनार के घर ना दीजो, मोहे जेवर कभी ना भाए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए। मोहे धन दौलत ना भाए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए, बिन बोले रहा ना जाए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए। बाबुल मोरी इतनी अरज सुन लीजो, मोहे राजा घर ना दीजो, मोहे राज ना करना बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए। बाबुल मोरी इतनी अरज सुन लीजो, मोहे लोहार के घर दे दीजो, जो मोरी जंजीरें जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए, बिन बोले रहा ना जाए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए बाबुल, जिया मोरा घबराए। this last piece is also by Zahra Nigam. It's a nazm. And it was particularly hard to compose, and it's often hard to perform, because it is written from the perspective of a terminated female fetus. It's called Main Bach Gayi Maan. Now this unborn child who has been terminated tells her mother that, you know, mother, actually, I think I've been saved. I've been saved from a life of subjugation, from a life of being reduced. Because if I grew up and my stature became taller than my father's, he would have subjected me to violence anyway. And my brother's honor would have taken a beating if I wore what I wanted. So it's maybe better that instead of listening to your lullaby, I fell in my own sleep. मैं बच गई माँ, मैं बच गई माँ, मैं बच गई माँ, मैं बच गई माँ। तेरे कच्चे लहू की मेहंदी मेरे पोर पोर में रच गई। तेरे कच्चे लहू की मेहंदी मेरे पोर पोर में रच गई। माँ मैं बच गई माँ, मैं बच गई माँ। गर मेरे नक्श उभर आते वो फिर भी लहू से भर जाते। मेरी आँखें रोशन हो जाती तो तेज़ाब का सुरमा लग जाता। सट्टे वट्टे में बट जाती बेकार में काम आ जाती। सट्टे वट्टे में बट जाती बेकार में काम आ जाती। हर ख्वाब अधूरा रह जाता, हर ख्वाब अधूरा रह जाता। माँ मैं बच गई माँ, मैं बच गई माँ। मेरा कद जो थोड़ा सा बढ़ता, मेरे बाप का कद छोटा पड़ता, मेरी चुनरी जो सर से ढलक जाती, मेरे भाई की पगड़ी गिर जाती, तेरी लोरी सुनने से पहले मैं अपनी नींद में सो गई, तेरी लोरी सुनने से पहले मैं अपनी नींद में सो गई। अनजान नगर से आई थी, अनजान नगर में खो गई माँ, मैं बच 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 गई माँ। Thank you. That was all.
Thank you guys. One more time for Apoorva Mudgal Ensemble. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So before we end, Noor from SAAG, South Asian Avant-Garde, has a couple of things to share with you guys. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you again next year on Women's Day.
Thank you so much again. Please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our amazing, amazing panelists, and of course to this amazing ensemble. You all brought tears to our eyes today. Thank you so, so much. Yeah, it's been an honor and a privilege to listen to your music and to your words. I am an editor with the South Asian Avant-Garde Anthology. We're, as we were talking about collectives a lot today, we're a collective made up of writers, artists, editors from here, the US, across the world, and primarily in South Asia and its numerous diasporas. Our anthology is intended to interrogate the idea of the avant-garde and expand its understanding from a revolutionary perspective. And we are publishing, we're a volunteer group, and we publish on a regular basis. And so if you're a writer or an artist or a journalist and you're part of the South Asian community or its diasporas, or you want to write about the South Asian community, or even if you want to write about associated and affiliated issues, because we try not to sort of be stuck within borders, please follow us on Instagram and on our numerous social media sites. We're hoping to release our issue, Volume 2, soon, and we're going to have a launch event for that on March 30th at, let me check, at Shapeshifter Lab in Brooklyn. But please follow us on social media to learn more about that, and we hope that you will join the community. And thank you especially to Kamli for inviting us to be a part of this event, and we're so grateful for the community here. So thank you all for being here.
So the social media handle that Noor didn't tell you is SAAG Anthology. So SAAG SAAG Anthology is the handle on Instagram, on all the platforms, and Kamli is Kamli.NYC on Instagram. So follow us. We're both volunteer-based organizations, and so whenever we do things, you'll hear about it.
Yeah, and our information is also on the Eventbrite page, so you can also look us up over there. Thank you all.